And now we move to this. Lucas Mangope, A Life, looks at the life of controversial Bophuthatswana leader as his subsequent loss of power. The book navigates Mangope's style of leadership that critics label as complex but clouded with the self-enrichment. Joining us now is Oupa Segalwe. He is the author of the book, Lucas Mangope, A Life, and Nelson Kgwete, who is a public servant, joining us in studio. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Great having both of you in studio.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So this is how we're going to do it. By the way, just an explanation quickly to our audience as well is, so Oupa has penned this book that we are going to be reviewing this morning. So we'll be speaking to Oupa, but we've also invited Nelson to be part of the conversation. He's read the book and would love to hear his opinion of the book and also maybe the questions that you have for Oupa in relation to the book. Oupa, let's start off here though. Yeah. Why?
Well, I have been explaining to say that around about age 10, back in the village of Motswedi, where I grew up and I was born, in a village where Kgosi Mangope was our chief or traditional leader. There was a lot of conversation around about then as change was sweeping across the country. And some of those conversations took place in my own household, where, you know, Kgosi Mangope was spoken of in glowing terms as one who had brought about a lot of development in Bophuthatswana. And the liberators who were approaching were said to be those who were going to take away all of those good things that Kgosi Mangope's government built for us away and leave us worse off. But out in the streets, when I interacted with other people, the conversation took a different turn in that it was said that Kgosi Mangope was actually one of those people who were trying to maintain the status quo, whereas the liberators were bringing about change that would see us enjoying equal rights with our white counterparts. So I grew up with a bit of that contradiction, and later on in life, I noticed that this is a story that has largely been left untold, and I decided to take it upon myself to document it.
But have you been able to come to a conclusion, though, for yourself on the character of Lucas Mangope from the research that you've done and the people that you've spoken to, especially with the family members as well and those who have worked with him? How would you describe him? Because I find it interesting also looking at the book, Lucas Mangope, A Life. Yeah. It almost feels that it is definitive, a life full stop. I expected a life of what, a life of something. Yeah. So it seems that it was quite deliberate.
It was deliberate because one had to take into account the fact that Kgosi Mangope was a very polarizing figure. You have as many people who revered him as those who, you know, took a different approach in terms of what he stood for. And I suppose in coming up with the title, we decided to go for a neutral one so as not to alienate any of those people. But to answer your question, I think the evidence speaks for itself. You have to look at Bophuthatswana the way it was, how it came about. It was a homeland that was established on the strength of a piece of legislation passed in South Africa, and yet it was supposed to be independent of South Africa. And so I agree with the notion that says that homeland was so much an extension of apartheid South Africa, and Kgosi Mangope then, as the one at the helm, would be seen in those terms as some sort of an enabler of that system.
Okay. And Nelson, what draws you then to the character Lucas Mangope, also as a politician?
Yeah. For me, I want to start off where Oupa left off, when he says that the Bantustan, Bophuthatswana, was an extension of apartheid. I want to argue that it wasn't only an extension of apartheid, but it was a creation of apartheid, because the apartheid system had to rely on such independent states for it to prolong its lifespan. So when you look at across South Africa, Bophuthatswana, you look at Leboa, you look at Natal, Transkei, and other Bantustans, you saw a deliberate undertaking by the Pretoria regime to create these independent states so that they can prolong the lifespan of apartheid by keeping people in the homelands, black people, while South Africa, the rest of South Africa, for example, Witwatersrand, etc., were under white minority rule. So it was a way for the apartheid system to exist and prolong its lifespan by having black people such as Mangope keeping the natives in the reserves so that the prime land in South Africa could be reserved for white people.
What then do you read into, even though it is known as a Bantustan by some and a homeland as well, but then you have this pushback that comes from Mangope, especially during the era of the Kgwete negotiations, refusing to have that particular title also as an enabler of the apartheid government?
Well, he had to refuse because he wanted Bophuthatswana to be different from the other Bantustans, in that he had developed a system of laws and regulations in Bophuthatswana that were not applicable elsewhere in the other Bantustans, and also in South Africa. For example, when you look at Bophuthatswana in those days, they had allowed a system where gambling, which was illegal in South Africa, could be allowed. And so you saw a number of establishments popping up in Bophuthatswana that were gambling institutions, and South Africans in the Transvaal and in the Witwatersrand area in Pretoria, Johannesburg, had to travel to Bophuthatswana to go and gamble. And so the economy of Bophuthatswana benefited from some of the strict laws that apartheid government imposed in the rest of South Africa. But Pretoria also wanted Mangope to succeed because they wanted to use him as an example, to say, look at our system, it is working, the blacks are in charge of their own affairs. And that was the philosophy behind the apartheid system.
But does that take away his own agency and ability to actually think about development for his own people, irrespective of how he was being viewed by certain individuals? But does that take away his agency in saying that this is actually the type of development that I would love to see for my nation, also taking into consideration, for instance, how his family was able to build a school in the community?
I suppose there is some degree of credit that could be given to him for having been instrumental in terms of that infrastructure expansion that we saw in Bophuthatswana. But at the same time, you can't help but think about the fact that those developments were essentially fruits of a poison tree. This reminds me of something that happened in recent years when one of the local politicians here said colonialism and apartheid were not all bad because we benefited some sort of infrastructure from those systems. Yes. So if you look at it from that perspective, you kind of get conflicted. On the one hand, there's this infrastructure which the people still benefit from to this day if you go to towns like Mahikeng and all of that. But when you look at the genesis of that infrastructure, it gets muddy a bit.
Yeah, so after the break, we are going to read from the book. Nelson, you want to read something from page 145, as well as page 194 that we're going to explore further. But as we go to the break, I want to leave you with these words of Zitsana Kochukudu, who says that Mangope was cruel. He was the same as a hyena. A hyena does not kill its prey. A hyena does not kill. It eats its prey alive. We have further discussions around the life of Lucas Mangope after this. And welcome back. So we're still in conversation with Oupa Segalwe, who is the author of the book Lucas Mangope, A Life. We're also joined by Nelson Kgwete, who is a public servant, and if he has, of course, read the book. You want to take us to page, is it 145?
Yes.
Page 145. And this is as there are the Kgwete talks that are supposed to be taking place. And Nelson Mandela, a delegation from the ANC, goes to the Northwest to go and have a conversation with Mangope.
They want to convince Mangope to support the transition from apartheid to South Africa. And so in the book, Oupa writes that the ANC president, that is Nelson Mandela, didn't like Mangope much. He had previously made it clear that the ANC loathed Mangope from the bottom of our hearts. That's what Mandela said. And he had also labeled him a hallucinating megalomaniac Hitler. That is Mandela's description of Mangope as he had approached him to convince him to participate in the transition.
Yeah. For you, why specifically that excerpt?
It's interesting because Mangope had a frictious relationship with the ANC before the ANC was unbanned. But that relationship of friction and mistrust continued well into Mangope's old age, and even after he had died, that friction continued. And maybe Oupa can explain to us that type of...
Yeah, Oupa, speak to us about that particular friction, because wasn't his father also a person who endorsed the South African National, was it Congress at the time?
Certainly, his father was among the chiefs who were there when the ANC, in its earlier form, was formed in Mangaung. But also, if you look at Kgosi Mangope's younger days, he was introduced to ANC politics at St. Peter's, where he was a student of Oliver Tambo, and he was one of the young people who would be, rallied to go and engage in ANC Youth League ideas and so forth, although I could not find evidence of him being a member of the Youth League, as other people have suggested before. But
just I think it was at Lovedale College.
It was
sorry,
St.
not
Peter's.
Lovedale,
Yes.
St. Peter's.
St. Peter's, yes. But you see, he took a different route compared to all of those other people with whom he went to school, your Duma Nokwes, your Andrew Mlangenis, and so forth. He took a different route opposed to the armed struggle, believing that freedom could be, advanced in other ways. But I think his relationship with the ANC during the course of the Bophuthatswana regime got worse and worse, such that he is the only homeland leader who was taken to task in post-apartheid times. If you think about the Square Commission of Inquiry and all of the other things that happened after that, including the criminal trial that he could not survive politically. And of course, you see even as he tries to reinvent himself, rebranding the party that ran Bophuthatswana as the UCDP and being the official opposition in the Northwest, he still had those kind of frosty relations with the ANC. And as Nelson says, you see it even after his passing, that he was denied an official funeral, although Premier Supura Mahumapelo had tried to persuade President Jacob Zuma to assist.
Why was that? What happened there? Why couldn't they give him an official funeral? And you're right. For instance, on page 301, Supra Mahumapelo refers to a quote from Nelson Mandela: "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies." And this is on his failure to try and convince the government of the day, democratic state of the day, why there should be an official funeral for Kgosi Mangope.
We never got any response from the presidency as to what informed that particular decision. But it was difficult to make sense of it when you consider that people like F.W. de Klerk and others from that side were offered official funerals, although their families declined. You have people such as Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who was accorded that kind of memorial. So the fact that Kgosi Mangope was one who was singled out and denied that kind of honor tells you how he related with the ANC.
Yeah. And then you've referred now to the Square Commission, and of course then there was the trial that took place. Nelson is now going to take us to page 194 in relation to the trial. And one of the witnesses there, Dr. Kutsa, who is a former South African ambassador to Bophuthatswana, what he had to say about Mangope.
Yes. Firstly, when you're sitting here today and you think that South Africa would have an embassy in Mafikeng, it doesn't make sense because of where we are, the transition that we've been able to have. But back then, that was the idea of apartheid, that Bophuthatswana would be an independent state, therefore it could establish diplomatic relations with other countries. So the South African ambassador in Mafikeng came to the rescue of Mangope on several occasions, but on this occasion, when Mangope was now facing trial following the recommendations of the Square Commission, he had to call some people to argue in mitigation of sentence on his behalf. And one of those people was Dr. Kgwete, who was the South African ambassador in Mafikeng. So in the book, Oupa says that Dr. Kgwete told of how Mangope had been the driving force behind the development of Bophuthatswana and its capital, Mmabatho. The South African government of the time had regarded the homeland as a model state ahead of its counterparts being the other Bantustans or homelands. This reportedly saw Advocate Homu quipping that Mangope had nearly made the apartheid system to work. because that's what the establishment in Pretoria wanted. They wanted this Bantustan, this homeland, to succeed so that they can extol it, even internationally. When Kgwete would go to all different countries and they tell him, lift the apartheid system, he would say, but it's working, and he would use Bophuthatswana as an example.
Yeah.
So for me, it's interesting in two ways, that you could have Mangope relying on the apartheid system to prolong his lifespan politically, but also the apartheid system wanted him to succeed. So there was a symbiotic relationship there, which was supposed to prolong the lifespan of apartheid and make black people to remain in the homeland, and the whites enjoy the rest of South Africa.
And of course, he was then convicted. There wasn't a custodial sentence. Popo Molefe had also argued against that, the premier at the time. But here, when it comes to the question around justice, the question around justice is almost focused only around embezzlement of funds. Page 278, Saki Mufokeng speaks about he subjected his critics to torture, terror, as well as murder. Was there any ounce of, acceptance from his end that I did take part in the torture, and perhaps also called on the murder of certain individuals that were dissenting voices within the groups where I was leading?
So early in 1994, in post-apartheid South Africa, there was another commission of inquiry called the Tebut Commission, and it focused mainly on the bloody uprising that took place in Mabatu in March 1994, where we saw the AWB getting into Mabatu and shooting randomly at civilians and all of that. So that particular commission looked at, among other things, the atrocities that occurred in Bophuthatswana. And of course, other things were left for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You will see in one of the chapters I refer to some of the people who lost their lives and how they struggled to find closure, let alone justice, after that particular commission had concluded its job. Yeah.
But from his end, though, is there an acceptance
of
his role that he would have played?
He remained, he denied it. He denied any part in all of those atrocities to the very end. And even with regard to that criminal trial where he was found guilty, he still maintained his innocence. But interestingly, he never challenged that decision, despite that he was convicted at the level of the High Court, and he still had the entire hierarchy of the courts to
and his argument that the traditions of the customs allowed him to actually take money.
Exactly.
and royalties as well. In conclusion, Oupa, who would you say should get this book? And what would this book do even to the contribution to South Africa's political landscape in understanding the figure Lucas Mangope, as well as how his political party has now failed to contest the most recent elections?
I've been saying to people that this book is not about Bophuthatswana. It's about a man who had a life before Bophuthatswana and after Bophuthatswana. And I want to focus now on the post-Bophuthatswana days, where he reinvents himself and relaunches the party that governed Bophuthatswana as the UCDP. Much has been spoken in the country about cult politics. The UCDP was one such party which was built around the persona of Kgosi Mangope. And you see that towards the end of his political career, its support starts dwindling because there was strife within the party with people challenging him for leadership, accusing him of all sorts of things, that there was no internal democracy in the party. And the moment he moved away, the party's fortunes all but collapsed, because you started seeing them losing support, and the number of their representatives in parliament and in provincial legislatures going down, such that in 2014, the party was essentially wiped out of the political landscape in South Africa. Right now, as we speak, it failed to contest the recent elections. And that is largely because a lot of the people who used to vote for that party were more his supporters than they were supporters of the party. Because I believe a party should be able to stand on its own, on the strength of its policies that it is putting forward as proposals to influence what happens in public.
But I guess, like in the heydays, it seemed as something noble and great that you're able to have such influence. If you look at, for instance, what happened with the TLA, and how he was able to influence what was taking place there. But thank you so much for your time. That is Oupa Segalwe, who has written this book about the life of Lucas Mangope. This is the book. This is what the book looks like. And Andrew Manson here says, people either hate him for being a vicious tyrant or venerate him in the good old days of, quote, Bob. Here we have an assessment of Mangope that is well-researched, balanced and fair. And you have to take that credit, Oupa. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well done.
Thank you.
And Nelson, thank you so much for making time for us again.